What up, children's? Old man back shouting at clouds. The topic of this conversation again. I want to be able to get away from politics and social issues here at some point, but it's dominating our news right now, and honestly, for good reason. We have some stuff as a country to figure out, and along those lines, one of the big things that I think we have to figure out before we can move forward and really begin to fix anything in this country is how and when is it okay to disagree civilly, and when are times where it maybe makes sense, or maybe even if it's not the right outcome, it's not the ideal outcome, but it's understandable to not be able to disagree civilly. Because I think right now we're in a cultural place in our country where every disagreement becomes uncivil, and it doesn't need to be. All right, there are situations where it is a moral judgment, and in those cases, if you see something differently, you're probably going to have a difficult time disagreeing with somebody in a friendly way. But there are issues where we should be able to disagree and still maintain a healthy relationship with somebody. And I think a big part of the reason why things have gotten so toxic and so combative in the US right now is because our elected officials really don't have any incentive to try to get along, or try to reach across the aisle. They have some perverse motives in place that I think lead to an environment where they focus almost exclusively on areas where we really disagree and where those disagreements are the most likely to be hostile. I could make like an entire series of videos as far as why that is, and if you want to see that, let me know, and I'll try to explain it as best I can. Being not an expert on those things. But suffice it to say that I don't really think that's a hot take at this point. I think if you follow the evidence, it's pretty clear at this point that our elected officials don't really want to get along. And they don't really want us to get along with people on the other side of the ideological aisle. They have profit motives baked into all this. Campaign finance comes from their ability to divide us up, and again, I could spend hours talking about why that is, but just for the purposes of this conversation, assume I'm right about that. At any rate, so how do we begin to combat some of that? Because I do think it's really, really important if we're ever going to make any progress in this country towards things that matter to us. We have to force we have to force the hand of our politicians. They're not going to do this voluntarily. They're going to try everything they can to make sure that we focus all of our time and energy on issues that are really explosive and where people are very emotionally invested, because that's what's best for them personally, but it's not what's best for this country. So what's best for this country is if we spend a lot of time talking about the areas where there probably is a significant amount of overlap and we could get things done relatively easily, but then also figuring out, okay, where are areas where it's appropriate for us to just see things differently and still be okay at the end of the day? And like, we can go have a coffee together and be civilized with each other. And then where are the issues where really it might just be time to cut people off? I almost never advocate for that, by the way. I have some very, very good friends that we don't see a number of things the same way. And I like that. It challenges your beliefs. It makes you research your opinions a little further, makes you consider other perspectives. I think that's really healthy. But there are areas where that's just not going to be possible, right? So one example of that would be, if we're talking about racism, for example, and legalizing policies that are racist in their inception. Okay, I can't really get along with you if you disagree with me on that one, right? Like if you're in favor of like a new Jim Crow, yeah, we're not going to get along, because that's an ethical issue for me, right? if you're in favor of letting people starve in the streets so that billionaires can be rich beyond anybody's wildest dreams, yeah, ethically, I'm going to have an issue with that, right? So it may be tough for us to get along if that's truly your opinion. We just, at that point, we just don't share values. We don't share morals. And that's just not the type of person I'm going to surround myself with. It doesn't mean I'm going to be violent towards you. It just means I'm probably not going to spend much time around you at all or spend much time talking to you. Now, on the other hand of that, or on the other side of that, would be issues where I think we ought to be able to disagree about it and still get along, right? So what are some examples of those kinds of issues? Well, it usually ends up being the more dry issues, like maybe it's tax policy, maybe it's public transit, for example. So I can have a healthy discussion with somebody I don't agree with about public transit, and we don't need to end the day hating each other, right? It is possible for two things to be true. So for example, if I were talking to a very conservative person, they might not be a very big fan of having tons of public infrastructure. Maybe they say, I like to just own a car and I can go wherever I want to go, whenever I want to go there. And if people want nicer cars, they should get better jobs, right? Why do I have to spend my tax dollars so that people who, maybe didn't invest as much in their education or their development or haven't worked as hard in their career can get cheap transportation? Like, maybe the answer is you should try a little harder and work a little harder. And I think I can see where they're coming from and still disagree with them, but not think they're a terrible human being if that's their view. And I think those are the areas where we really should be talking about politics, right? Because we want to challenge each other's ideas in those arenas, but in a civilized fashion, right? Like I want to ask that person more questions. If your take is we don't need public transit, we need people to be more ambitious, invest more in their skill sets, and so that they can be of greater value to companies and command a higher salary. Okay, tell me more about that, right? Do you genuinely believe that is something that is realistic for everyone? And how would you address situations where you have somebody who just maybe doesn't have the same capabilities as another person? Maybe their ceiling is just by definition going to be lower than another candidate's. They're not going to be able to command the same salary. Shouldn't they still be able to get around? Like, can we agree that they should still be able to get to their job, even if it's not going to pay the greatest? I mean, we still need people to do that kind of work, but that's a conversation we ought to be able to have civilly. And if that person can provide good, insightful, data-driven responses to those questions, then I learned something from that. And then either I may be challenged to change my mind, or I learn even more about my position and I have a better argument the next time, right? So I either come out of that conversation more intelligent, more informed on an opinion that I will still hold at the end of the day, or I come out of that conversation, I get more informed, I become a little more intelligent, and maybe I've changed my position. Maybe I see it differently now. Maybe I learned some things I didn't know before, and that changes how I feel about this issue. Well, I think those conversations can be a really productive way to get there, but we have to approach those conversations with a willingness to listen, with some curiosity. And I think in the current landscape right now, that is just something you don't see much of, right? Because we've been convinced that the person on the other side of the aisle from us is our enemy rather than our neighbor or our friend or our family member, right? And I think social media has exacerbated this so much. It's made it so much worse because everybody's a keyboard warrior. You don't have to actually look this person in the eye when you're saying really terrible things to them. And that has also contributed to the coarsening of the dialogue. And I think that's really bad. I think we've got to try as hard as we can to simulate the experience of speaking to people when we're online. We have to cultivate that kind of mentality of like, even though I'm behind a keyboard and somebody can't smack me in the face for being rude, I still shouldn't be rude anyway. And I should seek to understand and be understood rather than seeking to dunk on people. And I think changing that mentality is going to be incredibly, I honestly think essential for us to move forward as a country and take the temperature down in the room a little bit. I think things are really bad right now, and it's in all of our best interests to not let that continue. When I say all of our best interests, I mean all of us, like voting non-ruling class people. We don't really benefit from that level of vitriol. And maybe the elites and the power brokers do, but we're not here to facilitate that for them. We need to hold them accountable for their part of the social pact. So the way we do that is by being the change we want to see in the world. And it's really, really hard right now because when someone is combative with you, it's incredibly easy to respond with the energy they are bringing, right? If somebody's being very rude to you and condescending, it's almost like it is so hard to not respond with that same energy, but it's also incredibly critical that you don't, right? Because you will not make your best arguments when you're in your emotions. And if you respond back with the same energy they've given you, even if you're right, and even if you have every right to respond that way, it won't make the conversation any more productive, right? It will only make it less productive, right? Because you've responded with the same energy they gave you. Now they're going to respond back with the same energy they just received. And it's just going to spiral and spiral and spiral. Pretty soon you're screaming at each other and nobody's actually thinking about what's being said. So I think that is an incredibly important step one in how we walk things back from the precipice here, which I think, look, if we care about America and the promise this country has offered, the time is now. We cannot let this get any worse. We have to take control. We have to understand that our elected officials really don't work for us at this point. If you disagree with me on that, bring some evidence, because the evidence I have seen shows exactly the contrary. It shows that regardless of public support for particular pieces of legislation, sorry, I said that poorly, but public support for legislation has virtually zero impact on whether or not that legislation passes or gets killed. Look it up. I'm not making this up. So it doesn't appear to be an opinion. It appears to be a fact that our elected representatives really don't work for us at this point. That doesn't mean we have to accept it. And it doesn't mean we have to make it easy for them to manipulate us. So I think it starts with having better conversations. It starts with realizing that we're all in the same boat together, and then shifting the conversation, holding our elected officials responsible for focusing on the things we want them to focus on. And maybe let's focus on some issues where there is agreement, where there is overlap. I know it's hard to imagine that at this moment in our history, but there are plenty of issues where I can find common ground with people on either side of the ideological aisle. So let's focus our attention on that. Let's have some intelligent conversations on those things. Let's learn other positions besides the ones that we hold. So if I could give you one assignment, if you have a particular issue that you care about, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's public transportation, maybe it's social safety net programs, go find somebody that doesn't agree with you on those positions and just ask them questions. Don't argue with them. Just ask them questions and listen to their responses. Just that. Take it home and think about it, and then do some research on the things that they responded with and find out, are you right or are they right? Are neither of you right? Is there something in the middle? And begin that process of learning how to do that in a more constructive manner. Okay? It's super important, and it's a skill set that's gonna benefit you beyond the world of politics. It's a skill set that benefits you in relationships, at school, at your job. If you can figure out how to be the cool-headed, rational person who takes the temperature of the room down and gets to the right answer, that's a very valuable person to have in your life, at your company, at school, on your sports team. So double down on that, build up that skill set, and it took a long time to get this country stuck in the mud as far as we are. It's going to take some time to pull us back out of it, and there's no better time to get started than now. So hopefully you find this one helpful. Hopefully it's something you can start putting into practice and working on. I love you very much, and we will talk to you on the next one.